want to go over the format of the event just to start a little bit so everyone has an idea of what this is going to look like. So we're going to begin this event with a focused Q&A with excerpts from the book being read and used for further discussion, and ask questions that we will do our best to address in the second hour of the event. So please ask questions throughout the event. We will do our best to try to get to them when we can. For all of you who don't know, all of the profits of this book are going to Indigenous-led charities, and we ask that if you're considering to buy this book, do you support your local left-wing bookstores like Another Story here in Toronto to really support local business if you can. So I want to begin with just a land acknowledgement from Toronto, where we are. We wish to acknowledge this land on which we and the University of Toronto operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this is the meeting place. It's still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work with them on this land, and it is the obligation of every Canadian to honor Indigenous life and commit to action founded in reconciliation. So I want to pass it off to Ellen.
Zeka runuha yunkiao is na adunhat kakwatono negono. The Tinuarado and Sungoya Bizu, only Tanu and Gwekon Hotel, so Munigaya take me down Huta. The Hayatan Stadion and Gwetsu and see Awando Scani Watari, Scani Guanagaritani, Iguayan and a cut some stuff that I couldn't quite say that that's the Tinuarado and you take me down Huta. In the Gwekon Hotel unit. The Gwekanote in Kiao is some Gwekanote in Kirihunia soon. It's no doubt on a substantial air and a Gwekon Hotel you could use a Gwekon Hotel in Kiano and quite soon. They don't know how only or this Niano to quite soon as the Kakwa of Nagon. Substantial, what's the Squanya that's in wine. It's no doubt it's Naguaco to the one, look at the other the Takweni, a Guayacon Hotel, the Tinuarado, and a Guayaco to the one next day, look at the other, just the air in Guayan and nothing was hard. The Tinuarado and on in the Guayacon Hotel and of Nagapsun in Kiao, in Guatani, one thing got a one, you got no head. You got Nigir and then Kasnigio. Then we're going to get soon, and we're going to want to dinner getting. The Tinuarado and on quite soon, on that soon. Kayari, not the good scene at the Godario, the Tinuarado and then it's canoe the Guatuaguana. Then I didn't have one ask them to that got an honest that was ahead that didn't go. The Tinuarado one. The Tinuarado one in the Guacon and the Garukiak and Guationi, the Tinagan and over the Agon and then Axota Albic Guatuaguana. Then on in the Gayari Nicaveragi, Nana Ajanaguati, Tarek and Guati, and a Ganaguati, Tanunak and Guati. In the Guacan Hotel and the Neston, a Yahoo. What can order Sony and Kisota Asitanica Caracqua? Then a hotel Yokoyo, then a Garusiak and Guati to Canol. Then a hotel Yokoshian Sony, and you take some hotel. You got that sweet. The Sego Yukiao, then I don't have, then honor Oira, they're going to hold the Oya Yakoyot and Kisota and Sitanica Caracqua with Conwarado. Tano, Tinuarado on in any Yakisuto everywhere. The Cano, no hotel, the Dino had any taking sound who the air in the Wahad in the hotel and Wahad and a staff and quiet taking sound who it's no Warado to Cotoni. Tano, the Tinuarado and you to a fair joke and Caracqua. The Sego has what said the Sego. You take me down with that to work at Dunhan, Urunguawi, Tanu, they want you got that Gari, they tell you one he, it's no Rado in any to what fear of Cacarapa. Tanu, it's no Rado and the Tarihawaku, why this is, you know what to own in a guy, take me down with them. The owner, I want them in a Hawanizera, I want you gonna get it. Oh, yeah, I want it, you got Castle, and you got Canisa on, you got Targisa when Sarako. Tony, I want to Takweni, Nagiro, you know what to get me good honey. There's one suitor. No what you got Targi, so when it's a Scana so what you go, Scana says so you go Rio, and I want to you got Stanny, no hotel. una awa na gaya kin sa hun si yung what they start and ni tip dik sa ago. So I just did an opening very quickly. I didn't do it justice to Ahandakari Wadekwa, where we start off our meetings, we acknowledge all those life forces that bring us the nurturing and the support we need to live on this earth, from the waters, the fish, the medicines. And for us, we call it Junhekwan, the three sisters, the sustainers of life, corn, beans, and squash, and to the heavens and the birds, the thunders, grandmother moon, and our elder brother, the sun. There was a lot more that I said, but I know everybody is anxious to hear the wonderful words that will come from the speakers here. I also acknowledge that I know that I forgot some things, and it's up to all of you to be mindful and think of them, those things that I forgot to say. We acknowledge also Mother Earth, because that's who we walk upon and who nurtures us and gives us good health. So, thank you for inviting me, and we remember that to keep the peaceful mind, to make changes for the children who are here and those yet to come. So,
thank you so much, Ellen. So Doctors for Defunding the Police are hosting this event, and we are very honored to do so. We were sort of asked to get involved with this book by a medical colleague who saw the kind of community we were able to build during COVID. And we really believe that people we'd be able to interact with through Twitter, social media, and the academic community at large would really benefit from a conversation like this. So thank you, everyone. This is truly an honor being able to hold an event like this. So before we begin with the discussion, I would just like to briefly introduce our fantastic panelists. So to begin, Dr. Cindy Blackstock is a member of the Gikson First Nation and serves as the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, and is a professor in the School of Social Work at McGill University. Her interests are culturally based equity, Indigenous child rights, and systemic advocacy. Ketsi Ellen Gabriel is a Kenyetse Haken, human rights and environmental artist and activist. She was chosen by the people of Longhouse in her community of Kanhasetake to be the spokesperson during the 1990 so-called Okra crisis. For 3 decades, Ellen has consistently advocated for climate justice and Indigenous peoples' self-determination, cultural and language rights, while opposing violence against Indigenous women. Finally, the author of the book of Finding for Hand to Hold, Dr. Samir Shaheen-Hussain, has been involved in anti-authoritarian social justice movement, including Indigenous solidarity, anti-police brutality, and migrant justice organizing for nearly 2 decades. He's a member of the Caring for Social Justice Collective and has written or co-written about the state of violence in healthcare for several publications. He's an assistant professor at the Faculty of Medicine at McGill University and works as a pediatric emergency physician here in Tokiake, or Montreal. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. So to begin, our first question is going to be directed to Samir. Samir, could you please tell us about your book and why is it entitled Fighting for a Hand to Hold?
Before I begin, I guess I'm in Montreal or Tiohtià:ke, and so I would like to acknowledge that this is, or that I'm located on unceded Indigenous lands, and that the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. And I respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. I just also want to acknowledge that I am using the territorial acknowledgement that comes from the Indigenous Directions Leadership Group at Concordia University. For us as settlers, it's important to acknowledge the land that we're on. And in the book, I make a point of acknowledging where the book was written. So beyond Tiohtià:ke, it was also written on many other lands. So I'll just quickly read that part. Basically, so it's not important for me to acknowledge that I spent chunks of time working on the manuscript in other places, including the traditional territories of several Indigenous nations, Abenaki, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Nanticoke, Lenni Lenape, Métis, Mississaugas of the Credit, Ramapo Lenape, and the Wendat. And the other thing I also mentioned in the book is a lot of the work I was able to do on the book was obviously I was able to do based on simple things like being able to use electricity. And I feel it's these things we don't always think about when we're doing acknowledgements. But in Quebec, for example, in the province of Quebec, a majority of the electricity actually that's produced throughout the province comes from electricity that's produced on the lands of Inuit, EU, meaning Cree, and the Innu, among others. And so that too, I think, is actually important because this is what's fueling the computer I'm using, the internet I'm using right now to be able to reach everyone. And so that's, I wanted to kind of make that clear, I guess, at the beginning of my acknowledgement. So sorry, Samir, to answer your question. Actually, even before getting to that, I wanted to thank you and the Doctors for Defunding the Police for organizing this. I'd like to thank all the other panelists for participating. It's really, truly an honor. I'd like to thank also, obviously, my publisher, and then people who read the manuscript in its earlier stages, including the many powerful endorsements that came before the publication, and quite literally hundreds of people who contributed to this book in so many different ways. So even though it's my name that appears on the book, it is a result of teachings I've received over the years, the work done by a ton of other people, and the relationships that have been built over time. And I think that that's obviously really important to acknowledge. And that's partly why I felt like it wasn't a question of accepting any of the royalties that come from the book. And as Samir mentioned, that's one of the reasons why all the royalties are going to be deferred. So to get to the actual answer to your question, Samir, in terms of why is the book titled as it is. So the title actually was a suggestion by a close friend who read an earlier version of the manuscript. And basically it's meant to be a nod to the A Hand to Hold campaign that I was involved with in 2018. I'm not going to kind of go over the whole campaign because we don't have time for that. But basically, just so for people who may not be aware of the situation that led to the campaign, in the province of Quebec, children across the province who required emergency medical evacuation by medical airlift basically in rural and remote regions of the province were transferred by plane, but where in a circumstance where the parents or caregivers were systematically refused. And this has been going on for decades. And it was actually a policy or practice that impacted all kids. But what we were realizing, at least at the Montreal Children's Hospital, or what we saw were basically all kids who were either EU or Inuit who were sent to us alone. And for some reason in 2017, basically I was involved in the care of 2 kids who were sent in alone. And I don't know why it was those 2 kids, but it was those 2 kids that had a severe, like a profound impact on me. They were very young, they were sent alone, they could not speak English or French, and none of us working in healthcare at the children's in the emergency department could speak Inuktitut, which is what those kids could speak. And it was very jarring. It was a very jarring reality to see these kids all alone, literally hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers away from their families. And beyond these individual kids, I think what struck me was the generations of children who had been separated from their families. And I think that was kind of coming to the fore very clearly. And so basically in the next few months, like in the fall of 2017, basically I ended up starting to look into this more carefully. And we started doing a bit of work and trying to lobby the provincial organization that is responsible for these medical evacuations to change things. I realized basically that this was not going to happen so easily. And so despite our best efforts. And so basically in January of 2018, the campaign was launched. And it went public and it made quite a significant impact very quickly. I think a lot of people were outraged. Within a few weeks, there was a lot of support, including from the other Montreal hospital, Saint-Justine, the Canadian Pediatric Society. There were open letters or petitions. And there was, as a result, there was basically a commitment by the health minister, Gaetan Barrette, at the time, to change things. This came on February 15th of 2018. What happened, and these are the images that folks are seeing, is that we realized that despite the health minister's commitment, kids were still being sent alone. And so the slide that you saw earlier was Charlotte Munich and her daughter, who had been sent from Kuujjuaq. She was in the ICU and then she was sent down here. And when Charlotte came down, she basically found her child with several intravenous lines, tube in her chest. It was quite shocking. And so that basically kept happening. There were kids systematically that just continued to be sent alone. In fact, there was actually no policy change that had happened. And so this was in March that Charlotte Munich went public with her story. And then after that was Anne Kelly, who went public with her story. And the picture here is that of her child. And this was about in late April, early May. And it was basically the same story. This child had a coin stuck in the esophagus and had to be sent down for it to be removed because they could not remove it up north. And they refused Anne from boarding the plane, even though she was able to board the plane, put him in the seat, and then they told her to get off. And she basically to the media, she reported that there were plenty of seats available. And then what ended up happening, if we go to the next image, the pushes basically kept happening. And then eventually, after several months, in July, this was the first child who was actually sent with a family, because at the end of June, there was actually a new framework that was implemented to make sure that kids had a hand to hold. And so this was the first child who was sent from Nunavik. So this is Julie Ike and her child. And we thought that was going to be it. It's over. Things have changed. But we were realizing that about half of kids were still being sent alone. And so if we go to the next image, what ended up happening was basically this family, Peleloon, and his son his son basically had a very, very severe medical condition and had to be transferred to Saint-Justine Hospital, which is the other hospital in Montreal. And the parents were refused. The parents in this case basically drove all the way to Saint-Justine. It was like a 15-hour drive in the middle of the night, despite being exhausted because the child had been sick for several days already. And so they basically drove to eventually be reunited with him. And so these are kind of the stories of these families who courageously came out publicly to denounce what continued to happen. And that's a bit of a timeline. I'm obviously, in the book, I go into a lot more details about things that were happening, but the motivation then to write the book itself came from an event that happened in June. So if we can go to the previous slide, there's actually a video clip I wanted to share from a news report at the time. It's 2 minutes, but I would urge everyone to pay attention, because there are several themes that come up here in the story that informed the reason for doing then deciding to do the book.
A rule that prevented sick children from traveling with their parents aboard medevac flights has been widely criticized in Quebec. After recent pushback, the government yielded and promised to let parents on board. At a community event at this mosque, the health minister was asked why that hasn't happened yet. CBC obtained a recording of his response, where he guaranteed someone intoxicated will be kicked off of a flight in the next 6 months.
Where someone will not be not allowed to get on the plane. Why? Because no one agitated, drugged, under whatever influence would get on the plane. any cost. That will not happen. And that happens all the time.
Those words led to a chorus of condemnation.
To have comments like that by a minister is totally appalling and unacceptable. We're going to demand that the minister resign from his position.
The head of an organization that represents Inuit in Quebec's north says he needs to apologize, and I don't think that will be enough. He needs to go. The trust is gone. Barrette backpedaled today, at first saying that people wrongly assumed he'd been talking about Indigenous people when he meant it more generally. Then, later, he offered this as an apology.
I can understand the sensitivity of that and the reaction, and I apologize for that. I'm quite sorry about that, but at the end of the day, can we move on?
The Premier is standing in solidarity with his health minister as a provincial election looms.
I think he's sorry that his words have been interpreted that way. I suggest that we leave it there.
Barrette did call the mayor of Kuujjuaq to apologize. The mayor says he does not accept the apology. He's demanding that the minister resign immediately. Jayla Bernstein, CBC News, Montreal.
So, I mean, I think, it's not going to be a surprise for many people, but there, in terms of how awful the stuff he said was already, the quote that was, the quote is basically came from a recording that someone did at a community event where he was basically going to a community center and before the elections, and this person, I guess, who was following the campaign asked him the question of why these kids were still being sent alone, and this is what he responded. What Barrette, I guess, didn't realize was that this person had the foresight to record him, and then I guess shared with the media. But what's also important, and I think what factored into the decision, because I definitely did not have any intention of writing a book, I can tell you that, when the campaign was launched. But what happened was, as we saw, there were many calls for his resignation from many people, from many groups, from many individuals, including Ellen and Cindy, who were on this panel, and who denounced what he said. But what was particularly jarring was that that call wasn't really taken up in the rest of Quebecois society. It made a lot of news for 24, 48 hours, and most people did kind of condemn it, but it didn't really follow through. And to me, basically what it meant was that was, that the message that it sends is that you can make those kinds of comments with impunity. And I think that that was one of the reasons for motivations for writing the book. And the other was that in Quebec in particular, the opposition at that time, and now the party that's in power, the Coalition Avenir du Québec, has categorically denied the very existence of systemic racism to this day. And those two elements, these are macro big elements of politicians taking these horrific positions, including around systemic racism, which the campaign clearly demonstrated exists. And so those two were major factors. The other element for the book comes from a quote that a former pediatric resident at the Montreal Children's Hospital shared with me a few weeks after the campaign was actually launched. So she basically wrote, "I can't even recall all the times in my residency that I was in a situation where this policy affected a child I was taking care of. We knew it was the rule, we knew it was awful, and yet we just kept going." And as I write in the introduction of the book, her words aptly describe our complicity in accepting the injustices inflicted on Indigenous communities. The danger with normalizing injustice is that even the most sensitive individual may become desensitized to the suffering it causes. And by using the hashtag A Hand to Hold campaign as a case study to explore unsettling truths about how colonial governments deal with Indigenous children and their communities, including a focus on the medical establishment's genocidal role in colonization and colonialism, the book is meant to make a modest contribution to ensure that we no longer just keep going. So to return to your question, Samir, and to finish, as I mentioned in the book's preface, the title is basically meant to honor Indigenous children who must continue in different ways and after all these years to fight for a hand to hold. in the hopes that one day soon they will no longer have to.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much for that answer, Samir. That was very in-depth to my question. So to move on, this is a question for Ellen, because in the afterword of the book, you write the following. Oppression and trauma inflicted upon Indigenous peoples have far more serious consequences than modern medicine can comprehend. And you go on to state that the complexity of health care is the complexity of healthcare is one that cannot be addressed properly if the history of oppression due to colonialization is not taken into consideration. Specifically, you write about multi-generational trauma and how the impacts are physical, mental, and emotional. You write about the spiritual impacts on cultural life and languages and the importance of land. Can you please speak to the connections between health, culture, language, and land?
Yeah, I mean, this has been going on for centuries. It's not something that that just happened in recent times. It's multi-generational in the sense that each generation of Indigenous families have experienced the dehumanizing of their body, of their being. You forgot to mention it's also affected our sexuality. There's a lot of things that we have as Indigenous people with the cultural components of our identity. Our language is connected to the land. Our culture is connected to the land, as I mentioned this previously. When I did a Honda Kariwateskwa, that we have to acknowledge all those things that nourish us, that keep us safe, but we're also related to, whether it's the three sisters, whether it's the trees that have the same DNA, similar DNA to us, whether it's the stars, which we call our ancestors, that have similar DNA to us. These are all the things that go into those components. And the whole goal of colonization and imperialism is to eradicate the identity and dehumanize the Indigenous peoples of those lands. And that was succeeded. They were quite successful. Canada, Britain, Spain, all the colonizers from Europe. We cannot just blame Canada. We also have to blame, we called it Ohuntukayun, and the old countries, as it was called by our elders, and across the pond. This is the mentality that came over from Europe. So, I'm not letting Canadians off the hook by any way, shape, or form. But this was all for the land, to take from the land, to commodify it, to dehumanize Indigenous people, the doctrines of discovery, which are racist doctrines that were created by the church. That continues today. Colonization did not finish, as Samir's book points out. It continues, and it took someone brave like Samir to point this out, and other doctors to help them along the way. But Indigenous people have been saying that for many generations, and we're still reeling from those effects of genocide. We can call it cultural genocide to try and alleviate that sort of guilt, that collective guilt that Canadians have. But it's genocide in every way, shape, or form. So when we look at trying to destroy a people, you have to attack the family unit, and that family unit is the parents with the children. And when you attack that family unit, you watch as the whole nation crumbles. It's slowly like that thing that's just moving in slow motion, but the impact is felt in our hearts and our minds and our bodies, our souls. And when you see that the Canadian government or the Quebec government is trying to say, they're trying to use the stereotype of drunken Indian. Basically, that's what Mr. Barrett was doing. You have to realize that the political leaders of Canada and Quebec and its provinces are not really well versed in what human rights means or in what colonization, the history of colonization. One of the international human rights instruments that is really pivotal to this is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, enjoyment of the highest sustainable standards of health and access to healthcare services, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, that says it's the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of physical and mental health. For Indigenous people, we have not been allowed to do that simply because we are viewed as the other. We are viewed as the dispensable people. We are viewed as someone who we get everything for free, but that's not true, right? There's a lot of misconceptions about who we are as human beings. And the best way that the government can justify its economic agenda is to continually keep us in poor health because we don't have access to the land that keeps us healthy, those medicines that kept us healthy, those spiritual ceremonies that kept us healthy and kept establishing and nurturing that relationship we have with the land, and all those things that I talked about. And the economic agenda, which still stands today, is something that we're still battling with. And for our culture and for our identity as human beings, but as the first peoples of this Turtle Island, it still remains a struggle. So I think that, and hopefully Samir's book and all the people who contributed to it will be able to teach something that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wasn't able to teach Canadian society, something that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples wasn't able to teach, and something that the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Commission wasn't able to teach the political leaders of today. So we're fighting back, and we need people to help us, because nobody listens to us, but they will listen to somebody who's not an Indigenous person. So I'm grateful to Samir for his efforts on this. You know, so.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I think going off of that, for Cindy, I have this question for Dr. Cindy Blackstock. In the foreword of the book, you write the following: while there are some detractors, most Canadians accept that residential schools amounted to cultural genocide. Yet, when the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls reaffirmed this finding 4 years later, many Canadians were not ready to take the next step. In June 2019, the National Inquiry released a final report that said Canada's long history of colonial acts, including the docile response of Canadian governments and institutions to the dramatic rate of violence against and disappearance of Indigenous girls and women, was genocide, full stop. The mainstream media pundits were largely aghast, suggesting that this was a serious overreach to say that Canada's colonialism met the definition of genocide. Why do you think there is such a resistance in Canada to acknowledge this genocide? And why has the government of Canada's apartheid system of public services to First Nations people persisted for so long?
Because Canada wanted it to be persisted. It wanted to keep Canadians in the dark. It's shocking to me, like the taking down of the statue of John A. Macdonald in Montreal. And the various people would come to John A.'s defense, and yet they don't know the historical record. They are not fluent in their own history. They've received a whitewashed history about what Canada is and what these characters are and what role they played in the fabrication of a country like Canada. And I think that what they've done is they've really kept non-Indigenous folks in the dark purposefully so that Canada can normalize its systemic discrimination and dehumanization of First Nations people, Métis and Inuit peoples in a way that supports their agenda. So like one of the things that I always point to, and actually Samir does in his great book, and I do recommend you all get a copy, I'm gonna use it in my course, is talk about some of the points in history where Canada could have saved thousands of lives of children, Indigenous children, and chose not to do it. And one of those I think is very current for now with the pandemic. And that's a gentleman that both Ellen and I have worked with Beechwood Cemetery on kind of this project called Reconciling History. And he was a doctor, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce was the chief medical health officer of the Indian Department. And what he found in 1907 is children were dying in residential schools at a rate of 24%, 48% if you track them over 3 years. And it was due to TB. And what Bryce found is the citizens of Ottawa were receiving 3 times the amount of health care of all, quote, Indians across the country. And he went back to Ottawa and he said, look, make sure there's equality in health and implement reforms like not putting sick kids in with healthy kids, ventilate the buildings, all this stuff that we're hearing about COVID prevention today, and make sure there's sanitation in the buildings, and you could save many of these children's lives. The Canadian government took out its calculator, realized it cost $10,000 to $15,000, and said that was too much money, even though they were running 100 million. Now, if we fast forward, so the 4,000 to 6,000 children died in those schools as a result of that. Dr. Bryce continued to try to speak out and grab the attention of the Canadian public, and some people did respond. It was on the front pages of newspapers. There's a lawyer named Samuel Hume Blake that said that Canada failed to obviate its preventable causes of death. It brings itself to unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. And Ellen referenced some of those other reports that in detail provide more and more of these stories where Canada failed to step up to the plate and actually make a difference in saving people's lives. Just last year, and that's why Spirit Bear's here, he's a teddy bear that represents all First Nations children and other children who are standing up for justice, and we're part of a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case filed in 2007 by the Assembly of First Nations and the Caring Society. And in 2016, Canada was found to be racially discriminating against 165,000 First Nations kids by underfunding all children's services on reserve and in the Yukon. And they were ordered to stop. They can march out their politicians, they say, oh, this is terrible, and then they do nothing. So last year, the tribunal found that Canada's ongoing racial discrimination is linked to the preventable deaths of children and also to the ongoing separations, family separations of thousands of others. And yet, even though this is known in the public today, we don't get that same kind of reaction from the public because the public has normalized this. They've normalized the fact that we have an Indian Act. They've normalized the fact that, you see First Nations like in Mi'kmaq territory today, they get like just a couple percentages of the lobster fishery, and yet it's kind of like, oh my God, they're trying to take our lobster, like all these crazy things don't get questioned in Canadian society. So I think it's very vital for people to know the history. And the other thing they need to recognize is the important distinctions between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and among those groups. I've had the great pleasure of working with communities all over Canada, and I really respect the differences in those cultures, their languages, and their traditions. So we lose something when we homogenize people. So I'll leave it there, and I just don't want to leave this before I give my respects to the families of the 200,000 Americans who lost their lives due to COVID, and that number is counting, and I know that it is around the world. And I just wanted this moment not to pass without recognizing those families and communities, because in some ways they're just like Dr. Bryce. The solutions were there to keep the numbers down, but the government really murdered those people by policy.
Oh, thank you for that. So to move on to our next question. So the question I actually want to ask you, Samir, taking in the history of medical colonial violence to account, what duty do you think doctors have to their communities? And how can we change this relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think, everyone's basically addressed this issue already. Lisa clearly just did now. I mean, I think the first step, to be honest, in terms of, Lisa talked about curriculum. I think the first step has to be that we recognize that there is a medical culture, that it's not neutral, like Lisa said, and like I elaborate in the book, that there's, when I bring up the point of neutrality, medicine is not neutral. Medicine has never been neutral. Medicine has been, in fact, and I go over this extensively in the book, medicine has been a part and parcel part of the colonial project. Like, it's been an integral part, just even in terms of how the science of medicine was elaborated in the, if we kind of go back to like the 1800s and 1900s, it was an integral part of the colonial project. And so science evolved based on knowledge that was obtained through exploitation, experimentation on oppressed, exploited peoples. So whether we're talking about, as a group, whether we're talking about women, whether, the example actually is a pertinent one. There's a physician who's celebrated in the US, who has literally statues built for him, whose name is Marion Sims, who had a huge statue in New York, in Central Park, that was actually recently taken down, who basically is considered to be the father of gynecology. And a lot of our medical knowledge around gynecology comes from stuff that he basically wrote and published. What we are not told in medical school, despite the fact that there's very favorable discussions about him in medical textbooks and surgical textbooks, but what we're not told is that that knowledge came from the suffering, the inflicted suffering of Black enslaved women in the US. That's exactly where it came from. This physician was himself a slave owner and basically experimented on enslaved Black women, young women, girls as well, who were basically suffering from medical problems that we can again discuss, but that also actually came as a result of various issues tied to being enslaved, tied to being impoverished, tied to dealing with racism, tied to dealing with sexism. And all this knowledge basically has been passed down years, generations in the medical establishment. And over time, it's been completely considered to be depoliticized, like as if there was no history there. That's just one example, but there's so many examples. In the book, I talk about kids who were experimented on in residential schools. And Ian Mosby kind of did a lot of important work on revealing this a few years ago. But that knowledge ended up being used by scientists. I mean, Samir, you're in Toronto. At Sick Kids, there's a pediatrician who was the former president of the Canadian Pediatric Society, who was responsible for having created Pablum, the baby cereal. And he was basically involved with these experiments on Indigenous communities, nutritional experiments on Indigenous communities where kids were also impacted. So we need to basically kind of deconstruct this recognition or this thinking that that medical culture doesn't exist, or that it's neutral. I think that's kind of the first step. Now, the other point, I guess, that you're, in terms of kind of being accountable, I would, I guess, take a leap, and it goes down to the passage I was citing prior to Harsha's question, which is basically that as healthcare providers, I think that we need to go beyond looking at things in the walls of the institution. We need to, as Harsha was mentioning, recognize the connections between various people's realities and the struggles that a lot of those communities are engaged with to counter oppression, to counter injustice. And so I guess one of the points that I talk about in the book is, one push I make is to decolonize healthcare, but decolonizing healthcare has to happen in the context of decolonization more broadly speaking. And I guess if healthcare workers acknowledge that we're not neutral, that the institution is not neutral, that the establishment is not neutral, then the next step will have to be that we actually engage tangibly in social justice movements across the board.
That is an excellent answer. So the question I want to follow up with is actually for Ellen, if that's okay. And it's more about how we can all, basically, the question is, as non-Indigenous settlers on this land, so basically me and Samir and Harsha and some other people here, how do we support our Indigenous brothers and sisters in their struggles? What is the way that we should help them?
Yeah, that's a big question, because I think it's maintaining that support. It's not just when it's in the news. It's understanding that this is a daily struggle for Indigenous peoples, whether it's fighting back land dispossession, the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women, or on these issues that are affecting Indigenous families. I had mentioned earlier the impacts of multi-generational trauma, and one of those impacts is fighting colonization and the mental toll that it takes on you, and then what it the toll it takes on your body. I've been doing this for 30 years. I feel like I've been doing it for 100 years at this point in my life, because today we tried to stop, we tried to observe at least an archaeological dig that we were not informed of. And you know, we continue to fight those battles. And we had a meeting with the federal government representatives, Minister Carolyn Bennett and Minister Mark Miller. And we asked for a simple moratorium, just put a moratorium so we can sit down and discuss things. And their answer was, that's not in the realm of possibility. We're nowhere, you know, it all has to do about economics and political will. And when there's a lack of political will on the government side, that's where the people, the good people of this country, of this society, need to step up to the plate and educate themselves on what this thing, what colonization's impacts has done to our health and well-being. I talked about the rupture of the family unit before, but as an Indigenous woman, I know that we don't get taken seriously. I don't have a title. I'm just a Rudinisesago person, and I don't have the title of clan mother, I don't have the title of chief, and I don't recognize the legitimacy of band councils because they have been imposed. They're a colonial created construct that has been used to dispossess people and used to divide us. And so when we think about how can people help us, education is one. Come out to, you know, I know in a pandemic it's a little bit difficult, but support us in any way you can. You know, there's a bunch of us on Twitter, there's a bunch of us on social media. If people need to understand, fighting colonization takes resources. And as an Indigenous person, I do this on my free time. This is not something I get paid for. You know, I like educating people, but I have to work too. And it shouldn't just be up to fall on our shoulders to make the positive changes that we need in a society that we want to live in, right? A society that supposedly is what Canada aspires to, or is promoting everywhere else in the world except its own country with the First Peoples of this land. We need people to stop thinking about, you don't pay taxes. Well, yeah, we do. We have to pay taxes on things, and we are being crushed into smaller and smaller parcels of land. But we're supposed to be happy with the crumbs that are being thrown at us. And that to go into a legal court not only takes a team, a human resource team, but you got to convince a judge who is structured and is confined to the colonial constructs. He's not, or she is not working in a decolonial framework. They're working within the laws that have perpetuated racism, that have perpetuated the arrogance and the kind of structure that Indigenous people face. You know, and I mean this with no disrespect. I'm not a First Nations person. I'm Ganyak Kahaga. I don't live in a First Nations community. I'm Ganyak Kahaga. You talk about land acknowledgements. Those are the people of that land. And when we talk about that land, we talk about how are we going to preserve the land for 7 generations from now? We're living in a pandemic. We're living in climate change. Well, that's what Indigenous people who have been on the front lines have been trying to push back against. It's not just the flavor of the day. It's what we've been fighting for centuries. And why is it taking Canadians and the world so long to realize that it takes its toll? We have a toxic waste dump that is coming from construction sites in Montreal. I'm sure parts of the Turcotte Yard and parts of what was left of where the Shum hospitals are has come to Gunnesadage because there has been studies shown that the majority of toxic waste dumps are in Indigenous peoples communities or people of color. And as long as people are told what to think, as long as people are just barely surviving, like most people, especially in a pandemic where jobs have been cut, they're not interested in the plight of Indigenous people. So it takes to change the curriculum. Dr. Richardson was talking about changing the curriculum. Well, part of the curriculum for every single university or cégep in Quebec, their cégep, is to put in the reports of the Royal Commission, of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so that every judge, every lawyer, every teacher, every social worker, every doctor is well versed in Canada's colonial history and is part of the change, and is not part of, oh, teach us about colonization and how it has impacted you. Well, it's impacted me in ways where I was sick last year. I had to take the year off, and I have to say that I received really good medical care at the Montreal General Hospital. I had lung cancer. But these are the things that Indigenous people who are fighting on the front lines are experiencing, whether it's arthritis. We never, we don't have studies to say, well, arthritis is caused by colonization. Stomach ulcers are caused by colonization, or Indigenous people's shorter lifespan. We attribute it to poverty. We're not attributing it to one of the impacts of colonization, which is what it's exactly about. We have been impoverished. Right now, we're just seeing a boom in marijuana sales, which is like, I can't even tell you how difficult it has been to be in a community where in a pandemic, people from Montreal who have cabin fever come to Gunnesadage thinking that no laws apply here. And so this is another impact of colonization, to be constantly told by and implied by government. And this is what Minister Bennett said to me at a reconciliation conference, Truth and Reconciliation Conference in Gatineau. If you don't like it, then take us to court. So this is the attitude that we get. And then as we push back and we lose patience, and then we become emotional. Well, you can't listen to people who are emotional, right? You can't talk about things clearly if you're emotional. But we're constantly being under attack. We are scrutinized for every time we fart, every time we do anything, and if there's one bad apple, we're all bad apples. If someone comes in because they're self-medicating, because they're trying to deal with the pain of Indian residential school, and if people don't know about the stories, the horrific stories and the genocide of Indian residential school, I invite you to check it out and educate yourself, because it's not my job to educate people. It's not my job. My job is the same as your job, which is to contribute something positive to society. As First Peoples of this land, we are not Canadian citizens. I don't know about other Indigenous people how they feel, but Haudenosaunee people have maintained our citizenship, and people don't get it. We contribute to society. We are consumers. We are educators, and yet we are told you don't pay taxes, so you're not relevant. And that is the impacts of colonization. So when we go, like as Harsha described, there's this automatic, or Barrett described, there's this assumption that we either are drunk or high on something, or we're stupid, we're not capable of making decisions for ourselves. And that's what colonization is, and this is what the fight for a hand to hold is about. We will make the decisions for you, because under the Indian Act, which Canada is the most racist policy and law in the world is still practicing, under that we are still wards of the state. We are still children, according to the state. And how would you feel if that's how you were viewed by the bureaucrats, by the politicians? Every time there's an election, we are at the bottom of the rung of the issues that politicians are willing to take on. We are like the garbage. We are the disposable people of Canadian society, and we're so angry. Well, yeah. How would you feel if colonization and genocide was still happening, and nobody gave anything a care about it? And so for me, you want to help us. Help yourselves. You are colonized too. People don't see that. You are just as colonized as we are, except the only difference is this is our land. We are not giving it back to you because it was never yours to begin with. And all the institutions that have been created for Canada's prosperity have been on the blood and the backs of Indigenous peoples. And what needs to change is the way you choose your politicians, just as the way the Band Council criteria needs to change. It needs to be done by people who are compassionate, from people who have open minds to listen, the ears to hear. You know, when we do a condolence and we wipe away, you know, all that pain that you have, and we wipe away the tears from the trauma that you have, and we give you that drink of water to clear your throat, and take away those things that prevent you from breathing. Those are all the things about a condolence ceremony. And I think Canadians need a condolence, because you continue to make that same mistake over and over and over. And it doesn't matter how much education we try to provide you. The politicians at the end of the day, and the bureaucrats with their big government pensions at the end of the day, are still holding the line for corporations and for corrupt governments, and for the mafia. I'm going to say it, the mob and the mafia. They are behind. They're the puppet masters. And who are we? We're just little people in a cog in a huge machine. And that is the reality that we are facing. That is the reality that we as Indigenous people are facing. And when we are trying to protect our rights as our bodies, as our mental and spiritual, and then our lands. I mean, my goodness, how much money does Canada need to spend, and how many more commissions and reports does Canada need to do before it acts honorably, before it starts pulling up its pants and zipping up its fly and saying that this is what we're going to do and this is what we have to do. We've told you what you need to do. Do it. Do it. And look at your international human rights obligations, because there will tell you how your domestic laws should be guided. And I really want to apologize if I've offended anybody, but this is what colonization has done to me. I am so freaking frustrated that I am still here talking about colonization after all this time. My community and Kahnawake stood up against the Canadian Army and the Navy, for Pete's sake, and all of the provincial police in this province. And we're still fighting. What does that say about Canada and Quebec? They're corrupt. So people fight corruption, like the Harsha is dealing with you know, the system that creates people who are just perpetually in pain. And as medical providers and medical establishments, it needs to understand that the impacts of colonization are still ongoing. And what are those impacts? We use that word impacts and decide for ourselves in a very abstract way what that means. It means you hurt us. Genocide hurts. Colonization hurts. It dehumanizes you. So that, but you know, we're very lucky in that we keep our families close to us. And we have good friends and allies like Samir and Harsha and Lisa, who are trying to make changes. Because without you guys, we'd feel so alone. We'd feel like we're in the abyss. Sometimes it actually feels like we're living in an abyss. But this is who we are as human beings. That's what we are. We are human beings, and we just want to be treated like human beings and be respected, to have a right to live in freedom on our own territories and our own homelands. So thank you for listening to my rant.
Oh, no, thank you so much, Ellen. It's just, I think this ties in perfectly with what I want to talk to Cindy about following, which is, Ellen fully said it perfectly right there. We talk about the genocide of Indigenous people never actually ending. Can you speak about some of the conditions on the reserves and what the Indigenous people are currently dealing with? And why do they not have access to the resources, even though we apparently live under a universal healthcare system? What is going on?
Thank you, Samir. And I just want to start out by kind of really encouraging people to only use Indigenous when you're talking about all Indigenous people in Canada or worldwide. Because things like the Indian Act and reserves only apply to the group called First Nations. And I agree with what Ellen is saying, that within that there are distinct nations in those groups. So, but the Indian Act has created for Canada since Confederation a federal obligation to fund the services. And I think Lisa talked about First Nations and Inuit Health Branch and the programs that they provide for healthcare, which have been completely inequitable for many, many years. But that's just one example. I want you to just step back for a minute and think about what it is to live under the Indian Act. Then Bob Joseph's book, 21 Things You Need to Know or May Not Know About the Indian Act, is a must read for all of you. So I fall under that category. The first thing that they do is they measure whether or not the baby has sufficient blood quantum to be called by Canada as a registered Indian. Not by your nation, but by Canada as a registered Indian. And then Canada then decides that you can live on a reserve. And I want to just give a shout out to Art Emanuel, who wrote this book, and I really recommend you all read it. And really what he was pointing out there is the reserve boundaries have remained fixed since they were established. If we would have done that to Toronto, you would have all had overcrowded housing. Those boundaries for non-Indigenous folks have expanded. But for First Nations, those reserve boundaries have remained fixed. And the federal government has chosen, and I really want to emphasize this word because tomorrow we might have an election depending on what Trudeau does tomorrow night. They choose to strategically underfund every single service on reserve. And that actually has a colonial effect. I cannot live on my First Nation because there's not enough space. And I'm sure Ellen's community, there are community members who would like to come home, but you can't do that because the space is limited and the services are all underfunded. So that's why when Canadians turn on their television set and they see First Nations without clean drinking water, it's because the whole system is underfunded and designed to do that. Now, we had to litigate against Canada to try and bring the services up to equality. Now, just imagine having to litigate against the Canadian government when they already know that they're underfunding, but they know that they can buy themselves time by procedurally delaying the proceedings and by relying on Canadians maybe to get excited once or twice, as Ellen has pointed out, and Lisa has as well, but not to sustain that pressure. So tomorrow, if there is an election called, but even if there's not, I would ask that all of you get a hold of your elected official and tell them to do 3 things as a start. One is implement the Spirit Bear Plan to end all inequalities in public services for First Nations peoples. Number 2, implement the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report that Ellen is talking about. That thing in 1996 set out a 20-year plan to get out of the Indian Act. We're not out of the Indian Act yet because the government of Canada never implemented those recommendations. The third thing that I would recommend that you do is you get a hold of the TRC and the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report. Canada has done very little with those reports. CBC actually tracks the implementation of the TRC's calls to action. So you can see how little has been done on these various calls to action. And in terms of the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, that thing came out and the Prime Minister, I was over there across the river in Gatineau, they received the report and then they sat on it and did nothing. And then we heard in the middle of COVID, Carolyn Bennett come out and say, well, because of COVID, we're going to have to delay our response. I think there are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women around this country that wish they could delay dying or being hurt from violence, but they can't do that. This be patient speech, or why don't you wait a little bit for us, is a speech given by the colonizers. It's a speech offered up by those who are not suffering the wrongdoing. And I think we need to awaken Canadians to the fact that we live in a very similar type of country that we protested against in apartheid South Africa. So these reserves are apartheid regimes where the land, we've been pushed off our traditional territories onto these postage stamps. As Ellen rightly points out, they imposed a system of governance on us They underfund every service, and they issue cards about whether or not they feel your child is a status or non-status child. Imagine if today I became Prime Minister and I issued cards for whom I thought met the criteria of a status person in Canada, a status Canadian, if you will, and non-status Canadians. And the status folks, you get 1 in 6 of you doesn't get clean water. I know of communities right now in the middle of COVID, and they, of course, are at higher risk for COVID because of the systemic discrimination. But their top concern is not COVID. Their top concern is that they don't have clean water to drink. So Canadians, when you think about this stuff, don't feel overwhelmed by how complicated it is. Get out there and look at the solutions that are already on the books and get behind them, and keep talking to your member of parliament and to everyone else, and make it go up as an election issue, because 67% of Canadians want to see change. But when it comes to ranking what their top election issues are, as Ellen points out, we're way down at the bottom. So it has to be part of an ongoing conversation. And if not, then the same regime is going to perpetuate itself. And another generation of First Nations kids are going to have to litigate to just simply try to get a clean glass of water and decent medical care and to grow up at home. One caution I'd throw out there about the child welfare statistics before I end is that there are differences between those populations. So don't just say Indigenous children are overrepresented. There are different reasons driving First Nations, Métis, or Inuit children into care, and at different rates. And if you use that pan-Indigenous approach, you're going to miss those important drivers that are undermining the well-being of particular groups of children.
Perfect answer. Thank you so much, Dr. Blackstock. I think that was amazing. Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We want to remind you that every dollar from this book is going to Indigenous-led charities. There's no profit that's going to be made from this book. We really just want to make sure the information is out there and people are educated on these topics, because there's no excuse in 2020. Like, at this point, we need to understand what everyone is going through, and we need to have solidarity. So I'll leave it up to if Samir wants to have a last word, because he is the author, if you have anything to say.
I mean, I just want to thank everyone for like everyone who logged in, took time to make time for this, and obviously the panelists, Cindy and Ellen, who also contributed to the book, for which I am greatly humbled and honored. I tell people that you know, forwards and afterwards sometimes are kind of like add-ons, but I actually consider both the forward and the afterward as a core part of the book. And in fact, I actually intentionally decided not to write about certain things because Cindy and Ellen were able to articulate and eloquently make their points much better than I would be able to. But I would urge people who do get the book to consider as a whole. Like, please don't read, don't skip the forward and the afterward. It's part of the book. And thank you, Samir and Doctors for Defunding the Police, for organizing this, for hosting this first launch event. I think the conversation was really powerful. I think one of the points, there are many purposes for the book, I guess, but one of them is definitely to start, for those of us at least working in healthcare, to start recognizing that that health goes way beyond the walls of the establishment, and that there are truly structural factors that have significant impacts on the healthcare, on health for everyone. And going back to a point that several people have made in terms of reconciliation, I guess in a way, you know, to maybe use a bit of a sports analogy, apologies if that annoys people, but this book is kind of like a challenge to the reconciliation model in and of itself, in the sense that one of the focus basically is one of the points in the one chapter section I basically have titled as reparations before reconciliation. And the point of the book, to a large extent, is not kind of, when we're talking about challenging the reconciliation model, it's kind of like not getting into the end zone, but it's kind of like changing the whole where the goalposts are, right? Like we need to kind of expand our understanding of what reconciliation means, because the Canadian government significantly limits and controls what the understanding of reconciliation is. I don't doubt that many people are good-hearted and want to change things and reconcile, but like I've written, reconciliation cannot happen without reparations and cannot happen without acknowledging the history of colonization, not as a legacy, but as something that's ongoing and that we have to work to dismantle, because it can't be left to our Indigenous community, to our Indigenous brothers and sisters, like was mentioned, to keep having to fight. We have to fight as well.
I think that's a beautiful way of ending it. This is the beginning. So we are hoping to go on a book tour with this, actually, where you're going to have interviews as we go along and try to flesh out these ideas more and more with other doctors and professionals across the country. So hopefully this is the beginning of so much more. We just want to thank you all for being here, and we hope you all have a great night. Take care, everybody.